Chapter 1. The kettle whistled just as the clock struck 4. An ordinary sound in the drawing-room of Elderflower Cottage. Mrs. Cynthia Mott, a widow with a flair for lace doilies and strong opinions, glanced toward the hearth where the tea-things waited. The fire crackled gently, its warmth spreading across the worn rug. On the stone hearth just beside the iron fender lay something oddly out of place. A baby's blanket, folded neatly with pink stitching, soft and clean. Yet there hadn't been a baby in Elderflower Cottage for nearly 30 years. Cynthia didn't notice it at first. She was busy entertaining 3 guests. The ever-curious Mrs. Petherbridge, who spoke as though she had swallowed a bird-cage; Reverend Allenby, whose tie was perpetually crooked; and seated calmly by the window, with her knitting in hand, Miss Jane Marple. "Oh, Cynthia dear, these little teas of yours are always a delight," chirped Mrs. Petherbridge. "Though I do say, the scones at the vicarage fete were rather dry this year. Didn't you think so, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple looked up, her needles pausing mid-stitch. "I find dry scones can tell you more about a cook's nerves than their recipe," she said mildly. "But I'm far more curious about your kettle." "The kettle?" Cynthia asked, a little startled. "Yes, that whistle, sharp and shrill. It startles the birds in my garden, even from 2 houses away." Cynthia laughed nervously. "It's quite old, like everything else in this place. I've meant to replace it for years." But Miss Marple's eyes hadn't moved from the hearth. "Odd," she murmured to herself. "So very odd." Reverend Allenby was rambling about parish budgets again, and Mrs. Petherbridge had launched into a tale about someone's nephew being dismissed from a post in London for confidential reasons. Cynthia refilled the teacups with a practised smile, her hands steady, until Miss Marple spoke again. "Cynthia dear, is that a baby's blanket by your hearth?" The room froze. Cynthia turned, squinting. "Good heavens," she whispered, moving toward it. "Why, I've never seen that before." Reverend Allenby stood as well. "Do you suppose someone dropped it here?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "Not likely. You'd notice if someone wandered in and left something so sentimental. No baby in this house, is there?" "Certainly not." Cynthia was flustered now. "And none visiting either. I clean here every morning." Mrs. Petherbridge leaned forward like a raven about to strike. "You don't suppose it belonged to poor Lily's child?" There was a pause. Lily Harborough. The name rippled through the room like a cold draught. She had died just 2 days earlier, in what everyone still whispered was a tragic fall down the old stone stairs at her rented cottage on Maple Lane. "A sad accident," Reverend Allenby said, as though on cue. "Terrible business." Miss Marple didn't speak. She only resumed her knitting, though her eyes watched the flickering fire and the blanket that had no reason to be there. It was a curious thing, that blanket. It was new, yet hand-stitched, lovingly made, yet oddly untouched by time or use. No one claimed it, and no one remembered seeing it before today. Cynthia picked it up gingerly and folded it tighter, setting it atop the mantel, as though placing it there would make it less peculiar. "I'm sure there's an explanation," Cynthia muttered. "Some child's lost item, perhaps blown in from the window." Miss Marple didn't respond, but the window hadn't been open. And she, for one, never believed in coincidences, especially not in St. Mary Mead, where the past always seemed to sit just beneath the surface of every polite smile. After tea ended and the guests began to shuffle away, Miss Marple lingered behind for just a moment. She touched the edge of the blanket with 2 fingers. The stitching was delicate, the thread pale rose. "I imagine Lily's fall must have been quite the shock," she said softly. Cynthia's smile faltered. Yes, it was. She hadn't been herself. So distant, poor girl. People said it was grief over the child she lost years ago. She'd never really spoken of it. Grief, Miss Marple echoed. Such a peculiar thing. Some carry it like a scar, others like a secret. Then she gently placed the blanket back on the hearthstone, nodded politely, and left, her knitting needles tucked under one arm. Outside, the chill of early autumn had crept in. Leaves crunched beneath her sensible shoes, and Miss Marple, though quiet, was already turning the pattern of the day over in her mind. A blanket with no child, a woman dead by accident, and a village that, as always, whispered in half-truths and silences. Something was coming. Something had already begun. Before moving next, Detective, where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comments, and if you crave more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file is even darker. Stay sharp. Chapter 2. The cottage on Maple Lane stood quiet under the slate-grey sky, its ivy-covered walls still streaked from last night's rain. A crow perched on the chimney, unmoving. Beneath it, Lily Harbour's garden had begun to wilt. Dream drooped. The rosemary hedge had gone wild. No one had dared touch a thing. The villagers called it the sad house now. Constable Finch, a stout, practical man with more experience breaking up pub quarrels than inspecting suspicious deaths, arrived mid-morning to complete what he referred to as follow-up tidying. He hadn't been present at the time of Lily's fall, off duty Sunday night, but the coroner had already called it accidental, and that was good enough for him. He unlocked the front door with a grunt. The air inside was cool, untouched. A cracked teacup still sat by the windowsill. A cardigan hung on the back of the kitchen chair. The stairs, steep and uneven, climbed sharply to a small upper landing. It was there, at the base of those stairs, where Lily had been found. Head twisted, body folded as though dropped from above. No sign of struggle, no blood, only a faint bruise on her temple and the broken pearl button of her nightgown. Finch stepped inside cautiously. The floor creaked beneath his boots. He made his way past the narrow sitting-room, pausing only when he reached the hearth. A soot stain marked the corner of the grate, too low to have come from the fire itself. Finch crouched to inspect it, then dismissed it with a grunt. "Old chimney," he muttered, rubbing at his moustache. "Could be anything." Still, he scribbled it in his notebook. Outside, a voice called gently, "Constable Finch." He turned to find Miss Marple standing just beyond the gate, wrapped in a dove-grey coat and holding a string bag of fresh scones. "Miss Marple," he said with some surprise, "didn't expect to see you out this way." "I find a little walk clears the mind," she said pleasantly, "especially when there's something that won't stop tugging at it." Finch shifted, uneasy. "It's already been ruled an accident." "I know," she replied, eyes drifting towards the window. "Such a tragic thing. Lily Harbour falling like that, and so soon after what she'd endured. Losing a child does something permanent to the heart. Finch cleared his throat. Not much to see here. Place was in good order. No signs of forced entry. She must have missed a step. Miss Marple nodded, then added gently, "You know, I once knew a young woman who fell down the stairs. But in her case, it was her slipper that did it, slipped clean off her heel, and left her unbalanced." Finch blinked. "What's that got to do with Lily?" "Just a thought," she replied, then added, "Did Lily have any visitors recently?" He hesitated. "Far as I know, only that cousin from Torquay, Maisie Fields. Came 2 weeks ago, stayed just a weekend, left Sunday afternoon." Miss Marple murmured. "And Lily died that very night." "I don't see what that means." "Nor do I," she said brightly. "Not yet." A beat passed. Then, as though only now remembering, she added, "There was a baby's blanket left at Cynthia Mott's yesterday, quite out of place. No one knew where it came from." Finch frowned. "You think Lily might have brought it, I think," said Miss Marple, "that people often carry memories with them, sometimes literally." She nodded a polite farewell and continued down the lane, her pace unhurried, eyes steady. Back inside the cottage, Constable Finch glanced again at the hearth and the dark smudge beneath it. He made a note. Possible transfer, blanket soot, then underlined it, though he couldn't say why. At the Rose and Briar tea-room, the gossip had already begun to ferment. "I heard she was pushed," said Vera Crowthorne in a low voice, and not gently. "I heard she screamed," whispered another. "Though the neighbour said she thought it was just the cat." "Pushed, screamed, or stumbled," muttered Elspeth Granger. "It doesn't matter now. She's gone." Miss Marple, seated alone in the corner with her tea, listened, without turning her head. Behind the chatter, she observed more than words. The tremble in Vera's saucer as she set it down, the too eager tone in Elspeth's voice. People were never quite as composed as they hoped to appear. Just then, a tall, narrow-shouldered woman entered. Her hat sat too low on her brow, and her coat was pressed but clearly old. She ordered nothing, took a table in the back, and pulled out a small red book from her handbag. Miss Marple's gaze flicked briefly to the woman's shoes. Sturdy, travel-worn. She recognized her from a church picnic years ago. Maisie Fields, Lily's cousin. How curious she'd return so soon. Chapter 3. The red book sat like a secret between the sugar bowl and the butter dish. Maisie Fields didn't read it so much as hold it, her gloved hands brushing the pages absently as she stared toward the tea-room window. Miss Marple, unnoticed in the corner, sipped her tea with a steady hand. She'd always said one could learn more from silence than from speech, and Maisie's silence was telling. A woman with nothing to hide usually opened her handbag for more than just a prop. But the red book remained in view, half open, unspoken. "I didn't expect to be back so soon," Maisie murmured suddenly, startling the waitress who had approached with the tea tray. "No bother, miss," the girl replied, setting down a clean cup. "We're glad to see new faces." "I'm not new," Maisie said softly, "just less remembered." Miss Marple heard every word, though her knitting needles never stopped their gentle rhythm. Later that afternoon, in the snug drawing-room of the vicarage, Reverend Allenby wrestled with his sermon notes while his wife rearranged a vase of late dahlias. "Jane Marple was in the tea-room again today," Mrs. Allenby said lightly. "She often is." "Yes, but sitting alone, watching that cousin of Lily's, Maisie Fields. Something about that woman puts me on edge." Reverend Allenby didn't look up. "She's grieving?" "No," said his wife, narrowing her eyes. "She's waiting." By twilight, Miss Marple had made her way to the edge of the village, to the weathered cottage where Lily once lived. She did not cross the gate. She simply stood a moment, considering. She had known Lily as a child, bright, a touch wild always. Peeking behind curtains, she wasn't meant to move. Then came the baby, the whispers of an absent father, and the quiet withdrawal. Lily had become a shadow. The baby's name had never been spoken aloud. Miss Marple turned back toward the road. A familiar voice called to her from behind. "Miss Marple." Maisie Fields stood a few paces off, her coat buttoned to the throat. "Maidens, your deceit. Saw you at the tea-room," she said. "I didn't wish to interrupt." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied. "You've returned so soon. Surely Torquay is a longer trip than most would make twice in a fortnight." Maisie hesitated. There were things to settle, papers, memories. She held the red book under one arm now, its cover pressed close. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to it briefly. "Lily always said she wrote too much," Maisie continued. "Journals, notes, scraps of poetry. I thought I might look through them, burn some, keep the rest." "A generous task, Miss Marple," said. Maisie's smile was brittle. "I owe her that." For a moment, both women stood in silence. The dying light casting long shadows across the road. Then Maisie asked, almost offhandedly, "Is it true someone left a baby blanket at a neighbor's house?" Miss Marple tilted her head just slightly. "Yes, folded, unused, left by the hearthstone." "Odd place for it." "Quite." Maisie clutched the book tighter. It wasn't Lily's. Miss Marple didn't answer. She simply watched as Maisie turned and walked back down the path, her steps too careful for someone simply grieving. That evening, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Cynthia Mott. They sat, with only one lamp lit, its glow softening the harsh edges of the room. "I've had the most horrid thought, Jane," Cynthia confessed, voice low. "What if it wasn't an accident?" Miss Marple didn't flinch. "And what makes you wonder that?" "That blanket, and the bruise behind Lily's ear. Reverend Allenby said it was small, but I've read enough detective stories to know a clean fall doesn't always bruise that way." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Have you mentioned this to anyone else?" "No," Cynthia said, shaking her head. "But I've felt something's wrong since the funeral, like the village is holding its breath." Miss Marple nodded. "It often does, until the wrong person exhales." Then she stood and peered once more at the blanket, still resting by the hearthstone. Her fingers brushed the edge. There, barely visible, a speck of soot. A memory flickered from earlier. Finch noting the same beneath Lily's fireplace. "Cynthia, dear, have you had your chimney swept recently?" Cynthia blinked. "Not since spring." Then how curious that the underside of this blanket shows soot, and only on one edge." Cynthia stared. "You think it came from Lily's house?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that someone moved it deliberately. and wherever it lay last, it knew a fire that no one has spoken of yet. A chill passed through the cottage. Outside, the wind stirred the garden hedges. Inside, Miss Marple stood by the hearth, turning a mystery over in her mind, not yet solved, but shifting in shape. A blanket, a journal, a cousin returned too quickly, and a woman who had once lived for a child she never spoke of. Something had been left unsaid, but not for long. Chapter 4. The next morning brought a reluctant drizzle, soft and persistent, coating the rooftops in a thin sheen. In St. Mary Mead, it made the stone pathways slick and turned idle gossip into murmurs exchanged under umbrellas. At Lily Harbour's cottage, Maisie Field stood in the narrow upstairs bedroom, her coat still on, a brass key in her hand. The room was sparse, modest furniture, a lace curtain yellowed with age, and a single oak writing desk that had clearly not been opened in some time. Maisie hesitated only a second before sliding the key into the bottom drawer. It clicked. Inside, folded with surprising precision, were a small stack of envelopes tied with string, a black and white photograph of Lily holding an infant wrapped in a pale blanket, and a single piece of stationery, unaddressed, unposted. She picked up the letter. Detucho, whoever finds this, if I have not said it aloud, it is because I have been silenced, not by threat, but by fear. He said no one would believe me, but someone will, one day. The rest was torn, the final line unreadable. Maisie drew in a breath, but didn't cry. Instead, she glanced to the photo and then to the blanket in the picture. It was the same blanket Miss Marple had mentioned, identical stitching, that same pale rose thread. Her hands tightened. Outside, rain streaked the glass. At the general store, Mrs. Petherbridge hovered near the seed packets, though she had no interest in marigolds. What I heard, she whispered to the postmistress, is that Lily left a letter, hidden somewhere. Maisie's found it, of course. Did she say so? The postmistress asked. She didn't need to. You can tell by the way she walks now, all stiff like she's bracing for something. Behind the rack of tinned peas, Miss Marple listened with polite detachment. She was there to pick up embroidery thread, but her mind was elsewhere. On the soot on the blanket, the bruise on Lily's temple, and Maisie's sudden reappearance at the cottage just one day after her cousin's death. She'd also noted the locked drawer when Constable Finch had last spoken of the desk. He'd said it was empty, but Finch had never mentioned a key. Miss Marple stepped into the aisle and greeted the women warmly. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Petherbridge said with a start. "We were just, well, you know." "I do indeed," Miss Marple replied, selecting a deep blue thread. "Curious how the most vital things often fit in the smallest drawers." That evening, over supper at the vicarage, Reverend Allenby read aloud from the parish bulletin, while his wife buttered a slice of bread with unnecessary aggression. "I passed Maisie Fields today," she interrupted. "She was carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Wouldn't say where she was headed." "Perhaps returning something," her husband offered. "She was heading towards the Harbour cottage, not away from it." He paused. "You think she's hiding something?" "I think she's returning something she shouldn't have taken." They ate in silence. After that, Miss Marple spent her evening by the window, watching the rain blur the edges of the village. The baby's blanket remained by Cynthia's hearth, but Miss Marple had noticed something earlier that struck her as increasingly odd. Only one edge of the blanket had soot, not scattered, concentrated, as though it had been pressed deliberately against a blackened surface. It didn't suggest accidental transfer. It suggested intention. And Lily had once had a fireplace nearly identical in construction to Cynthia's. But why move the blanket? And why to Cynthia's house of all places? She made a mental note to speak with Finch again. Then, almost as an afterthought, she opened her own knitting basket and removed a folded scrap of paper tucked there since that morning. She had found it beneath the church bulletin board, half crumpled, a page torn from a different letter. Couldn't live with it any longer. I left the parcel where it would be noticed. Someone will ask the right question. Someone always does. The handwriting matched Lily's signature from a birthday card she had once sent to the vicar's wife. Someone always does. Miss Marple folded the note again and placed it beside her tea. Meanwhile, in the back room of the Rose and Briar, Maisie unfolded the photograph again. She had meant to burn it, but her hands wouldn't move toward the fireplace. The infant's face was partly turned, indistinct, but the stitching on the blanket was unmistakable. She picked up the torn letter and smoothed it on the table. Then she did something peculiar. She opened her handbag, removed the red journal, and tucked the photograph and letter between its pages. A decision had been made, but not yet spoken aloud. The village, sodden and dark, settled into sleep. Curtains drawn, lamps extinguished, but Miss Marple sat awake. The blanket had been moved. A letter had been found. A second letter, torn, had not been meant for discovery. And someone, somewhere, was growing uneasy with the silence. Something, Miss Marple felt, had been hidden too well, not just from the eyes of others, but from the conscience of the one who had hidden it. And conscience, as she knew well, was a most unreliable accomplice. Chapter 5. The next day arrived with a brittle chill, the kind that made the hedgerows crackle beneath the first touch of frost. In St. Mary Mead, the pace of life slowed with the cold, but the undercurrent of unease stirred just beneath the stillness. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual and sent a small note to Constable Finch, asking if she might have a word before noon. Then, after breakfast and a polite decline of an invitation to bridge at Mrs. Crowthorne's, she walked through the back lanes to the edge of the village. There, in a converted stable that now housed a modest office, lived Mr. Colin Redfern, solicitor, executor, and confidant to half the wills in the county. A pale man with thinning hair and a temperament as crisp as his collar, Mr. Redfern had served the village for nearly 2 decades and rarely entertained unsolicited callers. But he made an exception for Miss Marple. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said with a professional nod as he showed her in. "A delicate matter, I presume." "Not at all," she said with a faint smile. "Merely a curiosity about a woman who died rather suddenly." Mr. Redfern blinked. "Lily Harborough?" Miss Marple nodded and folded her hands. "I imagine she had a will." "She did. Drafted nearly 5 years ago. Rather short, actually. Most of her possessions were to be donated or sold, with the proceeds left to a trust, originally for the care of her child. Originally, Miss Marple prompted. Well, after the child's death, she amended it. Left everything to a person named only as M.F. Her cousin, I presume. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured. Curious that it was never updated again. She hadn't been in recently. And the child? Was there ever a birth certificate? A death notice? Mr. Redfern hesitated. There was talk, but I never handled those records personally. Lily was private, extremely so. Did she ever speak of the father? Never to me. Miss Marple leaned back gently. Isn't it strange, Mr. Redfern, how some people rewrite their lives with absence rather than addition? He furrowed his brow. Pardon? Nothing at all, she said warmly. You've been most helpful. By early afternoon, Miss Marple met Constable Finch outside the post office. He looked flustered. I went back to Lily's, he said in a low voice. The fireplace. There's a mark under the grate. Not soot. Charred wood, almost like something burned directly on the stone. Interesting, Miss Marple said. And was anything missing? I wouldn't know what to look for exactly. But I did ask Maisie Fields if she'd taken anything. She said only a photograph for sentimental reasons. Miss Marple replied, non-committal. She wouldn't happen to have had a key to Lily's writing desk, would she? Finch shook his head. She said it was unlocked. Miss Marple's expression didn't shift, but she made a mental note. Maisie lied, and not just once. At the Rose and Briar, Maisie sat alone again. No red book today, just a cup of untouched tea and a mind elsewhere. Elspeth Granger, always drawn to the scent of secrets, approached with studied nonchalance. Still sorting through Lily's things? She asked, her voice syrupy. Just the last bits, Maisie replied. Must be hard, after all these years apart. You weren't very close, were you? Maisie's eyes narrowed slightly. We were more alike than people realized. Oh? Elspeth pressed, taking the chair opposite her. But Maisie didn't elaborate. Instead, she stood, left coins on the table, and walked out into the street, leaving behind a teacup full of cold tea and a woman deeply unsatisfied. That evening, Miss Marple invited Cynthia Mott for tea. They sat near the fire, carefully stoked but not too bright, and discussed nothing in particular until Miss Marple lifted the blanket once again. Did Lily ever speak of the child to you? She asked gently. Cynthia paused. Only once, years ago. She said the baby had been sent away for health reasons, that it hadn't survived. Did you believe her? Cynthia hesitated. No. Miss Marple nodded. Neither did I. Let the silence settle, then added, I believe the blanket was planted here to be found. Cynthia looked up. To what end? To spark inquiry. To stir guilt, perhaps. Or to shift blame away from someone. And toward whom? That, said Miss Marple, is what I intend to find out. But I believe the person who brought the blanket here knew it would not go unnoticed, especially by me. Later that night, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple opened her knitting basket once more. Beneath the skeins of soft wool, she had tucked the torn scrap of Lily's letter, now pressed flat and studied under a small magnifying lens. The ink had smeared slightly. Heat, she suspected, possibly scorched at the edge. She considered the partial phrase again. Couldn't live with it any longer. I left the parcel any longer. I left the parcel where it would be noticed. The parcel had not been left in Lily's house, but elsewhere, not hidden, not buried, displayed deliberately, the baby's blanket, and only one person so far had shown no reaction to its presence at all. Chapter 6. In the chill hush of Sunday morning, the bells of St. Mildred's Chapel rang with a mournful clarity. The villagers gathered in wool coats and gloves, their breaths visible in the crisp air. The pews filled slowly. Grief had a way of tightening the throat, even when no tears were openly shed. Maisie Fields arrived late, slipping into the back row, her eyes hidden beneath the brim of her navy hat. Miss Marple sat 3 rows ahead, her hands folded neatly, expression unreadable. The vicar's sermon touched lightly on forgiveness, then more firmly on guilt, the kind that nestled where no one else could see. His voice wavered briefly when he said, "Not all confessions require a pulpit. Some are whispered through deeds." In the silence that followed, Maisie glanced up sharply. Miss Marple noticed. After the service, the vicar's wife approached Miss Marple as the congregation filtered out. "You saw her, didn't you?" she whispered. "I saw quite a few people," Miss Marple replied, fastening her coat. "I mean Maisie." She was trembling, white as linen. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Do you recall the name of Lily's child?" "No," said the vicar's wife. "She never spoke it. Nor has Maisie." They both looked back toward the door. Maisie was gone. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the church records room. It was a narrow chamber at the back of the vestry, lined with shelves of aging registers, baptismal ledgers, of brittle envelopes tied in twine. Miss Marple's fingers moved with purpose. She didn't expect to find a full record, not if Lily had wished to keep things quiet. But secrets, she'd learned, always left smudges. She found it tucked between pages of an unrelated wedding register, misfiled or perhaps deliberately misplaced. Harbour-born infant, no name listed. Date of birth, March 1933. Mother, Lillian Harborough. Father. Status, child relocated to convalescent care. No further notes. No name. No burial. Just absence once again. She closed the ledger slowly. Meanwhile, in the parlour of Elderflower Cottage, Cynthia Mott opened the door to find Maisie standing on the step, pale and uncertain. "Maisie," she said, surprised, "do come in. It's bitter out." Maisie stepped inside and removed her gloves with stiff fingers. She began, then stopped. "I wanted to ask you something." Cynthia led her to the settee, poured her a cup of tea without asking, and waited. Maisie stared into the steam. "Do you believe Lily's death was an accident?" Cynthia hesitated. "No." Maisie exhaled. "Nor do I." "Then why did you return?" Maisie looked up, and for the first time there was something raw in her voice. "Because I think Lily wanted me to. Because I think she left signs. And I don't know if I meant to confess or to follow her." Cynthia's hand tightened around her teacup. Maisie continued, voice barely audible. "She told me once, after the child was taken, that something had broken in her, that she'd hidden it, but never healed. She said the past was a blanket, warm, soft, and suffocating." Cynthia blinked. "She used that word." Maisie nodded. I didn't understand it then. Cynthia slowly stood, crossed to the fireplace, and picked up the very blanket that had been so inexplicably left behind. She handed it to Maisie. "Do you recognize this?" Maisie took it, her fingers tracing the pale rose stitching. Her lips trembled. "Yes," she whispered. "This was hers. She made it herself. Before they said the child died." "But there was no funeral," Cynthia said quietly, "and no grave." Maisie looked up sharply. "Because he didn't die. At least, not then." The silence was instant and absolute. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had returned home, her notebook open on the small table beside the window. She had listed names, dates, fragments of overheard conversations. Now she added a single word underlined 3 times. Key. It had appeared in Lily's letter. Maisie had used it too. Yet no man had been spoken of by name. Miss Marple stood, her joints aching slightly in the cold, and reached for the church directory. One name stood out, not for its presence, but for its silence. Dr. Malcolm Shaw, a retired physician, now seldom seen. He had once been Lily's landlord, her occasional visitor, her benefactor, the village had said at the time. Miss Marple had never liked euphemisms that evening. As the wind howled faintly down from the hills and the fire in Miss Marple's grate dwindled to soft embers, a knock sounded at her door. It was Maisie. She held the baby's blanket in her arms like a relic. "I think I need to tell you something," she said. Miss Marple opened the door wider. "Then come in," she said, gently, "and start from the beginning." Chapter 7. Maisie sat in the high-backed chair nearest the fire, the baby's blanket folded across her knees. Her fingers never stopped tracing the stitching, as if the movement alone could summon the strength to speak. Miss Marple offered tea, but did not press it. She knew better than to interrupt a dam that was beginning, slowly, to crack. "It was 1933, Maisie began. I'd just turned 20. Lily was younger, but always seemed older, sharper. She had this way of watching people without making them uncomfortable. That's why he liked her." Miss Marple sat quietly. "Who, dear?" Maisie's lips pressed into a line. "Dr. Shaw." The name settled between them like a stone dropped in still water. "No one ever said it aloud," Maisie continued, "but everyone knew he took too long with her appointments, gave her help that never reached anyone else. She never told me exactly what happened, but one night she came to my room, shaking. She said she was expecting a child." Marple folded her hands. "And he denied responsibility." Marple folded her hands. "And he denied responsibility." Maisie nodded. "He was married, promised things, then disappeared, arranged for her to stay in that little cottage on Maple Lane, said it would be better for her not to be seen." "And the child," Maisie swallowed, "born early, sickly, a boy, no name. Lily said they'd taken him away for treatment, but she never received a letter. No death notice, nothing. And she changed after that. Quiet, jumpy, as if she'd begun hearing footsteps long before anyone knocked." The fire cracked, casting flickering shadows across the hearthstone. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "Why did you come back now?" "Because she sent for me," Maisie said, her voice tight. 3 weeks ago I received a letter from Lily. Short, not desperate, just resolute. She said she'd found something, something that changed everything. She didn't say what, only that she wanted me to have her red journal if anything happened, and now I found it in the locked drawer, along with the torn letter. She'd started writing a second one, but only the top half remained. I think she meant to mail it, but someone destroyed the rest. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The journal. Maisie reached into her bag and handed it over. The spine was cracked, its edges worn from handling. Miss Marple opened to a bookmarked page. I saw him again, outside the greengrocer's. 20 years, and he still doesn't meet my eyes. But I know. He saw the blanket I carried. He knows what he did. Another entry. The child is not buried. I've asked 3 hospitals. No record. No death. Only silence. Why did they lie? And a final one. If anything happens to me, it will not be an accident. Someone has kept this secret too long. Miss Marple closed the journal gently. You see now, Maisie said, eyes glassy. She was afraid. Yes, Miss Marple said, but also prepared. She left the blanket. She wrote the letter. She brought you back. Maisie exhaled. Then what do I do? You let me do what Lily trusted me to do. Miss Marple stood, took the journal, and moved to the small writing desk in the corner. She opened a drawer and removed her own notebook. There's still one question, she said, almost to herself. Why bring the blanket to Cynthia's? To draw attention, Maisie guessed. Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, or perhaps to place the past where it would finally be seen. Cynthia's home has always been the social heart of the village. What better stage for a quiet performance? Maisie's brow furrowed. Performance? Miss Marple offered a slight smile. Lily was no fool. She understood that truth isn't shouted. It's left somewhere it will whisper. Maisie stared into the fire. Do you think he killed her? Miss Marple's reply came carefully. I think someone ensured she could not finish her letter. Whether by violence or coercion remains to be proven. But either way, her silence was orchestrated. A pause. Then Maisie stood, the blanket still clutched in her arms. If you need anything else, she said, you'll know where to find me. I always do, Miss Marple replied. After Maisie had gone, Miss Marple opened her own fire grate and placed Lily's journal on the stone beside it, not to burn, but to study again in a better light. The stitching on the baby's blanket matched. Lily's handwriting, same curves, same precision. Miss Marple had seen such symmetry before. Women who survived tragedy often kept their control in pattern. The truth was close now. She could feel it, and someone else, she suspected, could feel it too. That same night, just before midnight, a shadow crossed the grounds of Dr. Shaw's house. No one knocked, but the light in his upstairs window flickered out all the same. Chapter 2. Year Dr. Malcolm Shaw had not been seen at church in over a year. He lived in a weathered Georgian house on the hill, set apart from the village by a narrow garden path, and a gate that always creaked a little too loudly. Once a respected man, he had quietly retreated from public life not long after his retirement, claiming poor health, though many whispered that guilt could dull a man's pulse faster than age. Miss Marple had passed his house many times but never visited, until now. She arrived just after 3 o'clock, with no appointment, no preamble, just a gentle knock on the door. When it opened, It was not the doctor who greeted her, but a housekeeper. "He's not well," the woman said immediately, eyes wary. "Won't stay long," Miss Marple replied with a smile. "Just a word or two. I believe the doctor and I share a memory." The woman hesitated, then let her in. The drawing-room was dimly lit. The curtains had been drawn, though the afternoon sun still filtered through the sides. Dr. Shaw sat in a heavy armchair, wrapped in a blanket. Not one made for a baby, but an old tartan, threadbare at the edges. His hands trembled as he held a teacup. "Miss Marple," he said without rising, "I expected you sooner." She took the nearby chair without being asked. "Most things," she said gently, "take the time they require." He gave a soft, hollow chuckle. "And some take too long." There was a silence. Then she added, "Lily Harborough died under suspicious circumstances. You were once very familiar with her." "She was my patient," he said quickly. Miss Marple's eyes did not waver. "She carried your child." His jaw tensed. "That was never proven." "No, it wasn't, because she was silenced before she could name you." "I didn't hurt her," he snapped. "I never laid a hand on her." "But you abandoned her," Miss Marple said, not accusing, only stating. He looked down. "I was afraid of losing everything, my wife, my practice." "So you arranged the cottage, paid quietly. You let her live on the edge of the village while your child was, what, taken? Given away?" His voice cracked. "I don't know. I wasn't told." "She believed the child died. She wasn't wrong. He was ill. They said he didn't survive the winter." "But there was no record," Miss Marple replied. "No grave, no certificate." "I asked no questions," he whispered. "I didn't want the answers." Miss Marple stood slowly. "You might not have killed her, doctor, but you built the silence she died in." He didn't answer, just stared into the cooling tea. That evening, Miss Marple visited Constable Finch. He was polishing his boots by the station stove, and looked up, startled. "I've something you'll want to see," she said. She laid Lily's journal on the desk and flipped to 3 marked pages. Finch read in silence. "Good Lord," he said after a moment, "you believe Dr. Shaw. I believe he has secrets, but I don't think he pushed her." "Then who did?" Miss Marple tacked the final entry. "The blanket must be found. Someone else knew. I'm not alone in this. There's another player," she said. "Someone who intercepted her second letter. Someone who feared what she might finally reveal." Finch frowned. "And the blanket?" "Left at Cynthia's for a reason. Lily trusted her, perhaps, or knew the house was watched. It was a message, one intended to be seen." Finch leaned back. "So you think we're chasing someone else entirely?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "we're chasing the one who never looked shocked when the blanket appeared, because they already knew it existed." That night, in the narrow back room of the Rose and Briar, Elspeth Granger pulled out a box from beneath the floorboards. It contained old letters, Lily's mostly, and one photograph, slightly burned at the edge. She stared at it, her mouth tight. She had loved someone once, someone who hadn't chosen her. She had watched Lily's life from a distance for 20 years. And when Lily sent that final letter to Maisie, when Elspeth intercepted it at the post office, She'd known it would all come out. Unless it didn't. Unless Lily fell. Unless the blanket found its way elsewhere. Elspeth closed the box again and slipped it beneath the floorboards. But she had missed one detail. Miss Marple had once borrowed tea from the Rose and Briar on a rainy afternoon. She had seen the scorched floorboard in the back, and she had wondered even then what was worth hiding under ash. Chapter 9. Miss Marple didn't like to pry, not in the vulgar sense of the word. But there was, she always said, a difference between gossip and inquiry. The former cluttered the mind, the latter revealed truth like a silver pin pricking through fabric. And so, late the following morning, she made a quiet visit to the Rose and Briar, not for tea, but with a ribbon tin under her arm, a flimsy pretext for borrowing a button that only Elspeth would have in her stock. Elspeth Granger greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're up and about early, Miss Marple. I find mornings quite productive. One sees things more clearly before the village is thoroughly muddled by opinion." Elspeth laughed, but her hand brushed her skirt as though dusting away something unseen. Miss Marple was led into the back room, small, cluttered and warm, with the scent of lavender polish. The tin was placed on the work table. "Let's see," Elspeth muttered, rummaging in a box of sewing scraps. "What colour button did you say?" "Oh, anything mother of pearl will do," Miss Marple said, watching the way Elspeth stood, angled slightly between her guest and the floorboard by the stove. There was a faint scorch mark near the edge, not fresh, but not old enough to be forgotten. Elspeth bent low to dig through another drawer, and Miss Marple very carefully let her eyes scan the skirting. No latch, but the board didn't fit flush. A woman could hide a great deal in a tea shop. "Here we are," Elspeth said, holding up a button with false cheer. "Only one left, I'm afraid." "It'll suit me fine," Miss Marple replied, accepting it. "Tell me, my dear, did Lily Harborough ever come here often? I imagine you must have known her well." The change was immediate. Elspeth stiffened, smile faltering. "We were friendly, in a general sense. She wasn't the social sort. But she once gave you a poem, didn't she? Years ago, about a snow-covered gate and a baby left waiting." Elspeth blinked. "How do you—" "It was tucked inside a cookbook she once loaned to Cynthia Mott. I happened to read it. Beautifully written." Elspeth set the button box down. "It was a silly thing. She liked to write, gave poems away like sugar cubes." "But you kept that one," Miss Marple said gently, "which means it mattered." Elspeth didn't speak. Marple rose. "Thank you for the button, and for the company." She left the room with the faint creak of the floorboard behind her. Elspeth remained perfectly still until the bell over the door tinkled closed. Then she rushed to the back, opened the scorched board, and pulled out the box. It was still there, but she knew it wouldn't be for long. Miss Marple didn't go home. She went straight to Constable Finch. "I need you to search the Rose and Briar," she said plainly. "Specifically, the floorboard behind the stove in the back room. There's a hidden compartment beneath. It contains documents that Lily wrote, and at least one photograph." Finch blinked. "You're certain?" "Not yet," she replied. "But I'm rarely wrong after observing a lie performed poorly." He rubbed his jaw. "Do we need a warrant?" "She won't wait long enough for 1. He sighed and grabbed his coat. It took 15 minutes for Finch to arrive at the Rose and Briar, and another 5 to convince Elspeth to step aside. She didn't resist. In fact, she looked almost relieved. When the floorboard was lifted, the box emerged, just as Miss Marple had said. Inside were letters, all written by Lily. Some addressed to Maisie, others never sent. One in particular caught Finch's eye. "I know who took the letter. I know who watched me from the tea room. The photo was meant to go to the police. I've kept the only copy hidden, but I feel her eyes on me every day now." Tucked beneath it was a photograph. Lily, with the baby, and in the background, faint but unmistakable, was Elspeth, standing by the cottage gate, watching. "I didn't push her," Elspeth said quietly. Finch turned. "But you took the letter, burned it, moved the blanket." "Yes," she whispered. "I panicked. I thought she would finally tell. And I couldn't bear it. And I couldn't bear it." "Tell what?" "That she had seen me," Elspeth said. "Years ago, in the clinic. I was pregnant too, but mine was taken. She knew how cruel they were. She told me to run." She sank into a chair, eyes glassy, but I stayed. And when she left, I hated her for it, for surviving what I couldn't. Miss Marple had entered quietly during the confession, unnoticed. "Elspeth," she said gently, "you didn't kill her, but you left her alone again in her final hour." Elspeth looked up. "And that's worse somehow, isn't it?" Miss Marple didn't answer. Some truths didn't need judgment. Chapter 10. By the next morning, news of Elspeth Granger's quiet confession had begun to ripple through St. Mary Mead. Not shouted, not printed, but carried in cautious phrases and lowered voices over teacups and at garden gates. "Not the sort you'd expect," someone whispered. "She always seemed so kind," another replied. But Miss Marple, who had known for some time that kindness and secrecy often shared the same shelf, wasn't ready to close the book just yet. Elspeth had intercepted Lily's final letter. She had moved the blanket, burned evidence, and watched Lily's suffering in silence. But she had not killed her. No one had seen anyone enter or leave Maple Lane the night Lily died. No signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds, and yet... "She didn't fall," Miss Marple murmured aloud that afternoon, seated once again in Cynthia Mott's sitting room. "Or at least she didn't simply fall." Cynthia looked up from her embroidery. "Then what happened?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "She was made to fall, by fear, by confrontation, perhaps even by someone she trusted." She rose and stepped toward the hearth, where her baby's blanket, still folded, had not been moved since its strange appearance. "It's odd, don't you think, that this blanket, so full of symbolic weight, should arrive here and not somewhere else?" "You mean it was meant for me?" Cynthia asked, startled. "I believe Lily wanted it seen, and your drawing-room is where things are always seen. But I no longer think Elspeth placed it here out of malice. Then who did?" Miss Marple turned slowly. "Someone who wanted to divert suspicion. Someone who knew Lily was about to speak. Someone who'd kept their hands clean while others suffered the consequences." She paused, then added, almost softly, "Someone like Dr. Shaw's wife." Cynthia blinked. "But She left him years ago, didn't she? Not quite. She lived apart, yes, but never divorced. She kept her name, her social standing, her silence, and in return, she made sure nothing scandalous ever surfaced. Miss Marple visited Constable Finch again that evening. She brought with her not only Lily's journal, but the church ledger and the photo from the box beneath the floorboards. "She didn't fall by chance," she said firmly. "Lily had summoned Maisie. She was about to send the second letter, and someone knew it." Finch frowned. "And you believe it was Mrs. Shaw?" "I believe she went to the cottage that night. Perhaps to reason with Lily, perhaps to threaten. Lily had the original photograph. Perhaps she showed it. She confronted her, and Lily turned to retreat, or to escape, and slipped." Finch rubbed his temples. "But we have no proof. We have the blanket," Miss Marple said, "placed in Cynthia's home to frame Elspeth, who was already known to be watching Lily. We have the journal, torn letters, and Maisie's return, timed precisely with Lily's death. And we have a name, mentioned in a nurse's note from the sanatorium Lily once stayed at. A visitor, Mrs. Shaw. Recorded under a false pretense. But she was there." Finch looked up. "You think she found the child? I think she found what was left of him," Miss Marple said quietly. "And I think she made certain no one else ever would." That same night, a carriage was sent for Mrs. Shaw. She did not protest. She wore her gloves. At the station, she sat upright and unspeaking as Finch reviewed the records. "Why didn't you just let her tell the truth?" he asked. Her answer came with chilling calm. "Because shame, once spread, cannot be gathered back." Then she turned to Miss Marple. "She was always weak, you know. Lily, soft in the heart. It was always going to undo her." Miss Marple did not reply. There was no dignity in answering cruelty. By week's end, the case was officially closed. The village murmured and then moved on, like it always did. Elspeth withdrew from the tea-room. Maisie returned to Torquay, leaving behind the red journal in Miss Marple's care. Dr. Shaw locked his doors and was not seen again. But Cynthia Mott, one afternoon, invited Miss Marple for tea and placed a final object on the table between them. "Doc, thought you should have it," she said. "It was the baby's blanket, folded clean, untouched by soot now." "I don't know what to do with it," Cynthia whispered. "It feels sacred." Miss Marple took it gently in her lap. "It is," she said. "It's proof that something beautiful once existed, even if it was hidden, even if it never got to speak for itself." The fire crackled, and outside the village lay still again, on the surface at least. But Miss Marple knew silence was never truly still. It hummed beneath the teacups, in old journals, and in the way some women never spoke the names of those who wronged them, but they remembered, and they left clues waiting to be seen. Chapter 11. Rain came soft and steady over St. Mary Mead, darkening the thatched roofs and soaking the empty lane outside Miss Marple's cottage. It was the kind of day when no one lingered long outdoors, where thoughts grew heavy, and memories, uninvited, stirred from the corners of quiet rooms. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, the baby's blanket folded beside her like a silent companion. Before her lay Lily's journal, pages now dry, but heavy with sorrow, and a letter she had written that morning, to be delivered by Constable Finch. It was addressed to the morning, to be delivered by Constable Finch. It was addressed to the county office, a request for a record that had never been filed, a name. The child, she suspected, had been buried quietly, perhaps under a false identity, perhaps under no name at all. There had been too many hands eager to silence Lily, to spare the sure name from scandal, to erase what could not be rewritten with polite lies. But somewhere, on a ledger, in a hospital, or at a graveyard's unmarked edge, there had to be a record, a fragment, a whisper left behind. At the vicarage, Reverend Allenby had just finished his tea when Miss Marple arrived. "I wondered if I might borrow your baptismal registry again," she asked gently. "Of course, Miss Marple," he said, already leading her to the narrow drawer in his study. "Still working through the harbour tragedy. Closing it, I hope," she replied. She ran her fingers along the spine of the old books, pausing on a slim volume marked 1933, 1934. Opening to the spring pages, she scanned the listings carefully. Then her eyes stopped. One line, lightly penciled in, then crossed out in ink. March 1933. Infant Harbour, to be named Thomas. Faint beside it, in a different hand. Entry removed at family request. Not confirmed, which meant he had lived long enough to be considered. Lily had chosen a name. Thomas. That evening, Miss Marple returned home and placed the blanket inside a wooden box beside the journal. She wrote a note in her own fine script. For the child who was loved in silence and remembered in thread, you were not unnamed. Then she sealed the box and placed it on the mantel. It would not be buried. Not yet. But it would be preserved. The next morning Constable Finch stopped by with news. "We got a match," he said, handing her a printed slip. "Private records from an old sanitarium. The child was listed as harbourity. Survived 7 months. Cause of death, respiratory. Infection. Date of death, November 1933. Miss Marple took the paper without speaking. Finch added more quietly, "He was buried in the Pauper's Field. No headstone." "I see," she said, folding the paper neatly. "So it's done now," Finch said. Miss Marple looked up. "It will never be done, Mr. Finch. But it has been seen, and that is something." He nodded slowly. "There'll be no charges against Mrs. Shaw. Nothing solid enough. I suspected as much. She'll leave quietly. Reputation intact." Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "Let her keep it. Her silence will weigh more than any prison walls." Finch hesitated. "You think she feels guilt?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "But guilt isn't always what punishes a person. Sometimes it's survival." The village returned to its slow rhythm. The tea-room reopened, though Elspeth Granger no longer worked the counter. Cynthia Mott resumed her tea parties, though the tone of them was a shade more cautious, and Lily Harbour's cottage remained empty. A "For-Let" sign was posted discreetly by the garden gate, but no one inquired. The roses had begun to grow wild again. Maisie sent one last letter. No return address. Simply thanking Miss Marple for listening to what most never asked. One afternoon, a month later, Miss Marple visited the Pauper's Field on the far edge of the next parish. The grass was patchy. The stones, when there were any, were small and plain. She found the approximate place, kneeled, laid the smallest bouquet of violets, Lily's favourite, on the ground. She didn't speak the name aloud, but it rang clearly in her mind. Thomas, not forgotten. That evening by the hearthstone, Miss Marple sat once more with her knitting. She picked up a fresh skein of rose-coloured thread, the same shade Lily had used, began a simple pattern, nothing intricate, just rows of warmth. Outside the rain had cleared, and in the hush of the cottage the only sound was the faint clack of needles, the turning of a story that had waited far too long to be told. Chapter 12. The soft hush of early winter had crept into St. Mary Mead. Chimneys began to smoke earlier in the day, and the lanes wore a dusting of frost like lace stitched across the hedgerows. It was a season that wrapped the village in silence. But this silence was different from before. It wasn't one of suppression. It was one of reflection. At Elderflower Cottage, Cynthia Mott prepared for her winter luncheon, arranging the table with practised precision. The baby's blanket, once a strange and unsettling object, had now found its place, not hidden, not revered, but folded neatly on the arm of a chair near the hearth. "You've kept it?" Miss Marple asked as she entered. Cynthia nodded. "I thought about putting it away, but it doesn't feel haunting any more. It feels witnessed." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then it has served its purpose." There were fewer guests this time, just the vicar's wife, Maisie's distant cousin, who'd stayed behind to tend Lily's legal affairs, and Miss Marple herself. Conversation remained polite, but not superficial. The village, it seemed, had found new ways to speak honestly, though only in measured teaspoons. "I heard Elspeth moved to Yorkshire," the vicar's wife mentioned, stirring her tea. "A cousin with a dairy farm." "New beginnings," Miss Marple murmured. "And Dr. Shaw?" "Quiet," Cynthia replied. "Sells his prescriptions by post. No one sees him, and no one asks." No one needed to. That evening, Miss Marple received a package, no return name, just fine cream paper and a parcel tied with blue string. Inside, a single silver thimble and a note. "For every stitch that ever told the truth, thank you, M." Miss Marple held the thimble in her palm for a long time before tucking it into her sewing box beside the rose thread. Constable Finch came calling 2 days later, removing his cap respectfully as he stepped inside her warm, lamplit cottage. "I've been writing up the final report," he said. "Wanted to be sure it matched the truth as we know it." Miss Marple poured tea and motioned for him to sit. "You'll write it as an accident, of course," she said gently. Yes, he admitted. "We've no witness, no confession, nothing the courts would hold." "And yet justice has settled, hasn't it?" she asked. Finch exhaled. "In a way. Funny how many crimes happen not from hate, but from fear." "Fear," Miss Marple said, "is terribly underestimated. It makes people silence others before they can even speak." He nodded. "Will you be keeping the journal?" "I'll leave it with the county archive." Quietly. "There's no need for drama now." "Good," Finch said, standing. "Still, feels like the sort of thing only you could have seen." Miss Marple smiled. "Only because I was willing to look." A week later, the final clue found its resting place. Miss Marple returned to the Pauper's Field. this time with Cynthia beside her. Together, they placed a small wooden marker in the soft earth. Nothing ornate, no full name, just one word, carved carefully Thomas. They stood quietly after that. No prayers, no fanfare, only presence. Back in her sitting room that evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting, a fresh square of blanket growing in her lap. She paused, holding it up to the light. Same rose thread, but it was not the past she was weaving any more. It was something new. Outside, the wind stirred the ivy on the window-sill. Inside, the hearthstone glowed, a place once marked by silence, now warmed by memory. Chapter 13. It was a morning like any other in St. Mary Mead. Dew glistening on stone garden walls, chimney smoke curling into pale blue skies, and the faint scent of baked bread wafting from the tea-room. The village had, as it always did, returned to its rhythm. But there was a difference now, though no one named it aloud. The silence had changed. Where once it had masked, it now memorialized. Where once it had hidden, it now hummed with remembrance. The post office. Constable Finch dropped off his final report. Harborough Lily. Accidental death. Fall from stairs. No charges. No trial. Just the record. Neat and unassuming. But attached to it by Finch's own hand was a second file. An internal note marked confidential. Inside it were copies of Lily's journal, the torn letter, the photograph, and Miss Marple's written account. It would never go to the newspapers, but it would not be lost. Finch called it addendum for the record of conscience. He sealed it quietly and locked it away. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple received one final visitor, Maisie Fields. She wore no hat this time. Her eyes were clearer, and in her arms she held a small parcel. No return address, no name. She handed it to Miss Marple without a word. Inside was a folded dress, pale, soft, stitched in the same rose thread as the blanket. It was Lily's, Maisie said. She made it while expecting. Said she would keep it for the day he came home. Miss Marple touched the hem, her fingers gentle. And now, Maisie's voice wavered. Now, I think it should stay here with you. Miss Marple didn't argue, only nodded. Together, they placed it inside the same cedar box that held the blanket and the journal. And this time, Maisie closed the lid herself. Days passed. The baby's blanket never returned to the hearthstone, but its meaning remained. Cynthia Mott often paused by the chair where it once lay, not with fear, but with something close to reverence. At the Rose and Briar, a new girl took Elspeth's place. The floorboards were polished, the scourge marks scrubbed clean. But every now and then a customer would glance toward the back room, as if remembering something they'd never truly been told. Dr. Shaw sold his house and moved north. No farewell. No note, just gone. Mrs. Shaw, when last heard from, had taken residence at a private home for retired ladies of stature. No visitors, no inquiries. Her name would never be spoken in connection to the case. But Miss Marple knew better than most. Silence could be its own form of legacy. On the last Sunday before Christmas, Miss Marple sat beside the fireplace, tea steaming beside her The room filled with soft light. The cedar box sat on a low shelf, not hidden, but not prominently displayed. It had no label, no inscription, but those who had seen it never asked what was inside. Some truths, once told, did not need repeating. As the church bells rang faintly through the window panes, Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the fire, where orange embers flickered like memory. Her knitting lay idle for once. She thought of Lily, of the blanket, of Thomas, of all the lives touched by that one name so nearly forgotten. And she thought, too, of the quiet courage it took to leave behind a trail, however faint, for someone else to follow. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no arrest, no newspaper headline. Just a pattern slowly unraveled and then woven again, truth by truth. That was the way justice moved in places like St. Mary Mead, not with thunder, but with threads. And Miss Marple, with her quiet needles and sharper mind, had seen to it that every thread had found its place. As night fell, a knock came at her door. Cynthia, holding a small gift, just a ribbon-wrapped bundle of new wool. "Same color," she said. "I thought you might want to keep stitching." Miss Marple smiled. "There's always something to finish." Cynthia lingered. "Do you ever wonder if there are more like Lily?" Miss Marple looked at the fire. "I don't wonder, dear. I know there are." "And what do we do then?" "We listen," Miss Marple said. "We watch. And when the silence begins to shift, however faintly, we follow it." And so the village slept again that night, the hearths glowing, the wind light in the hedgerows. But one cottage, tucked near the end of the lane, held a light a little longer, and inside, an old woman with needles in hand stitched steadily beneath that glow, knowing that the past was no longer haunting the present, but finally at rest within it.